Hello everybody, and welcome to the video. In this episode, we're going to work on spawning our player into the game when we start it up. So let's go ahead and jump right into that. The first thing that we're going to need to do is I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this one prefabs. And then I'm going to drag my player object into the prefabs folder, and that's going to create a prefab of the player. And then I'm going to go ahead and delete that from the scene since we're going to spawn it in when we start the game up here. The next thing is I'm going to create an empty object over here, and I'm going to call this player spawner. We're not going to want to add our script to the world generator like we have these other ones here. This way we can keep the logic separate. And of course, we're going to need a new script as well. And this one I'm going to call our player spawner. So let's jump into our player spawner script. First, we're going to want to set up some of our field declarations. So here we're going to have several serialized fields. The first one is going to be our player prefab, and this is going to be of type game object. And this is just going to be the game object that we're going to use as the player, and it's going to be instantiated in the scene. The next one that we're going to have here is our world generator. And so this is going to be a reference to our world generator script. And that script is where our world is generated, and we're going to use this to know when the world is ready for the player to spawn. And we're going to be using events to do that. And then the last one here that we're going to want to do is going to be of type float. And we're going to call this one our Y offset. And by default, I'm going to set mine to 2.0f. And here we're going to be adding a small offset to the y-axis to make sure that the player spawns slightly above the ground level, and this way they don't spawn inside of a tile. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up an event, and this event is going to basically listen and wait until the world is generated, and then once the world is generated, it's going to tell us that it's okay for us to spawn our player. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and hop over to our world generated script, and we're going to start here. So the first thing that we'll want to do is we're going to want to set up the event. So up top here, we're going to say public event, and then we're going to say action. And I'm going to call this one on world generated. And that's going to be our event that gets triggered when the world generation completes. So once we set this event up, you'll see that now we have an error here for random saying that it's ambiguous, because I can't tell if it's from Unity Engine or system.random because the events use system here that we brought in. So what we can do for these, we can set both of these to Unity Engine here, because we have one here and then we have another one down here. So here we have our event on world generated, and this is going to be an event that our world generator script is going to trigger after the entire world has been generated. And this is going to let other scripts like our player spawner script know that it's safe to proceed with certain actions that depend on the world being ready. And using an event system like this is going to allow us to avoid constant checks in our update, for example, in our player spawner script. And this will make it just a little bit more efficient for us. And then down here in our start method, we're going to say our on world generated and question mark, and then we're going to say dot invoke. And so we're basically saying that after the world is generated, we're going to trigger this event, and this is going to signal that, everything's set up and it's ready for the player to spawn now. And that's all that we'll need in this script for now. So we'll jump back over to our player spawner. So back here in our player spawner script, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to set up an event listener. So we're going to do our world generator dot, and then on world generated, the event that we created there. And here we're going to be subscribing to this event. And then once the world is done generating, the on world generated is going to be triggered, and it's going to call a method that we create. So here we're going to do plus equals, and then we're going to type in that method now. We haven't created this yet, but we're going to call it handle world generated. So we're basically going to be saying, what to do when the world is generated. And so now, since we haven't created this, we can simply just click this and generate the method, and it'll create it right below us here. And then in here, in this method, what we're going to be doing is we're going to start up a coroutine that we'll have to create as well here in just a second. And that coroutine is going to wait until the world generation is fully ready and then spawn the player. So here we're going to type in start coroutine and then the name of that coroutine, which we're going to call spawn player when ready. And then, so now we'll go ahead and we'll create that coroutine, and this is going to be a private and IE numerator. And again, we're going to use what we called it there, spawn player when ready. And here we're going to type this out quick and then I'll explain it. So we're going to say yield return, and here we're going to say new wait until. And inside here, we're going to say equals and greater than sign. And this is going to be our world generator dot top row heights. And we're going to say does not equal null. So here, what we're doing is we're using the yield return and waiting until. And then what we're doing is we're basically going to wait until our top row heights is not null, meaning that the world is ready for us to spawn the player. And then once that's done, then we're going to spawn the player. So then we'll call another method called spawn player, which again, called spawn player, which again, we'll have to create in a moment. But basically, once this is ready, we're going to spawn our player. And now here we're getting an error message saying that top row heights isn't accessible. And that's just because we need to go back into our world generator script here. And then in here, we're going to do a public getter setter for our top row heights. So we're going to say public and then int and an array. And we'll call it again, top row heights, curly braces, and then we're going to do get, and then we're going to say private set. And then we'll just have to fix this a little bit. So down, if we scroll down to our generated world method that we had before, currently we have this as the array. We're simply going to delete that. So we have a few errors here now with the top row heights after we moved the int there. And if we go back up to the top, I spelled this wrong, H-E-I-G-H-T-S, but if we simply change this to a T, a lowercase t, that's going to get rid of all the errors, but I actually want this to be an uppercase T, so I'm going to do Control RR to rename this, and then go like that, and that'll change all of these for us. So now we don't have any more errors, and then also got rid of our error that we were getting over here. And so now the next thing that we need to do is we need to work on our spawn player. So now we'll start on our spawn player method. So again, we can simply click this and that'll generate a method for us here. So the first thing we are going to want to do before we start working on the spawn player method here is we're going to set up a singleton reference for the player instance. So I'll do that right up here. And this is going to be a private static, a game object. And I'm going to call it player instance. And then now if we head back down to our spawn player, the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to check if the player instance is already assigned. So that means if there's already a player in the game, then we're going to immediately return. That way we don't end up spawning multiple players. And this is going to make our player a singleton, meaning only one instance can exist. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if the player instance does not equal null, then we'll simply return. And then we're going to do another check here. So the next one is going to be if the player prefab does not equal null. So if we're able to find the player prefab, then this is where we'll go ahead and set up most of the logic for spawning the player. So here we're going to want to set up, or we're going to want to calculate how we're going to spawn, like the spawn position of the player. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to say int spawn column, and that is going to equal our world generator dot width, and we're going to divide that by 2. So that's basically going to be right in the middle of our world. And here you're going to see, again, this is inaccessible due to protection level because it is private. So here we have just a serialized field for our width. So I'm just going to simply go ahead and turn this into public and save that. And that should get rid of our error. And now we're going to use this spawn column to set up our spawn position. So here we're going to have a vector 3, and this is going to be our spawn position. And this is going to equal a new vector 3. And so for here, for the X, we're going to use our spawn column. And we're going to say plus 0.5f. And that's just so it's offset a little bit. So that way, when the player spawns, it's in the middle of the grid instead of right on the lines of the grid. And for the Y, we're going to use our world generator.topRowHeights. And this is going to be in the array. And here we're going to use the spawn column. And we're going to do plus the Y offset that we set up. And then again, plus another 0.5f. And then for the Z, we're going to do 0. And this is just using the top row heights. So the very top of our specific spawn column that we are spawning in. And then we're going to add in our Y offset to push us up a little bit so that we don't end up spawning into the world. And then the next thing that we're going to want to do is actually instantiate the player. So that's going to be our player instance. And here we're going to say player instance equals instantiate. And we're going to instantiate our player prefab at the spawn position. And we're going to use quaternion.identity for the rotation. And then lastly, since we are subscribing to this event up here, we're also going to want to unsubscribe from the event. So we're just going to say void on destroy. And in here, we're going to say if the world generator does not equal null, then world generator dot on world generated, and then we'll say minus equals. So we're unsubscribing from that event there. So at this point, we should be able to go in and actually spawn our player. So if we jump back into our editor here and grab our player spawner script and attach it to our player spawner, here we just need to set up our player prefab, our world generator, and if we wanted to change our Y offset, we could do that here. So we'll drag in our world generator, and then we'll go into our prefabs and drag in our player. And now if we click play, we should see our player being spawned. All right, so here's our player. That seems to work. You'll notice that the player bounced up, which is something that we obviously don't want to be happening. And our camera isn't actually looking at our player anymore, even though we had it set up to follow the player. But one thing is we're dynamically spawning the player in, so we can't actually have like the player set up in here beforehand. So we're going to have to set this up in code. So we'll do that here in a moment. But then also, like I said, there was that little bounce at the beginning. So if we just do this one more time here, you'll see the player bouncing like that when they spawn in. We obviously don't want that as well. So we'll fix that. So let's go ahead and fix the virtual camera first. That should be pretty easy for us to do. So the first thing that we're going to do is at the top, we're going to go ahead and add in another serializable field. And this is going to be a Cinemachine virtual camera is going to be the type. And we're simply going to call it virtual camera. And all that we really need to do to make this work is down here when we are spawning our player, right underneath our player instance, for example, we just need to set the Cinemachine camera to follow the new player instance. So we can simply say if the virtual camera is not null, so if there is a virtual camera, then we're going to go ahead and do virtual camera dot follow, and that's going to equal our player instance dot transform. And we'll do the same thing here with virtual camera dot look at. And that's also going to equal our player instance dot transform. And if for some reason these don't pop up for you automatically, you might have to come up here and add in using Cinemachine. Mine did it for me automatically though. So if we come back into our editor now, under our player spawner, we're going to have an area here for our virtual camera. So we'll just go ahead and drag our virtual camera in here. And if we click on our camera, you'll see that right now we don't have our follow or look at set up by default, since we did delete our player from the scene earlier. But now if we go ahead and click on play, these should end up being populated with our player as they're created. And we are now following our player. So we're now going, left and right, just like we were in our previous episode. So that's how we fix the follow camera there. So for the bouncing, I'm not 100% sure what's causing our player to bounce up as soon as they spawn. And there's probably multiple ways to fix this, but I did find a pretty simple way to fix it. And that's what I'll be using here. So what we're going to be doing is we're basically going to freeze the position and rotation of the rigid body that's attached to the player. And then we're going to wait a couple, like 0.2 seconds or so, and then turn them back on. So pretty easy. So to do that, all we're going to have to do here is we're going to want to access the rigid body component that's directly on the player instance that we're creating. So to do that, this is going to be rigid body 2D, and I'm going to just call it RB for rigid body, and that's going to equal our player instance dot get component. Oops. And component of type rigid body 2D. And then we're going to do an if statement here, and we're going to say if the RB is not null. So again, if there is a rigid body, then we're going to want to temporarily constrain the movement on the y-axis. So we can do that by saying rb.constraints. And that's going to equal our rigid body constraints 2D dot freeze position y. So we want freeze position y, and then after we freeze the position on the y, we're going to want to start up a coroutine that's going to enable physics after a short delay. So here we're going to do again start coroutine, and the coroutine that we're going to start is one we'll have to create again in just 1 second, but we're going to call it enable physics after delay, as that's pretty much what we're doing. And in here, we're going to pass in our rigid body. And again, we'll have that error for a second here. But all we have to do is come down here and we'll say private, i.e. numerator, and then the name of it, which is what we typed up there. So enable physics after delay. And in here, we're going to be passing in a rigid body 2D called RB. And I spelled this wrong, so just make sure you spell it right. So in here, we're just going to set up a short delay. So we're going to say yield return new and wait 4 seconds. And then how many seconds we want to wait. For us, we're just going to wait for like 0.2 F. So a very short time. And then we're basically going to say if the rigid body does not equal null, then we're going to want to remove the constraint. So here we're going to say rb.constraints, and that's going to equal our rigid body constraints 2D. And here we're just going to say dot freeze rotation, because we want them to still be able to move on the X and the Y axis, but we do want the rotation on the Z axis to be frozen. And if you go back into our editor here and go to the player, and if we look at our rigid body for the constraints, you'll see that the position we have X and Y, but we do want the only rotation we have is on the Z axis since we're in 2D here. So we want them to be able to move on the X and Y, but not rotate on the Z, which is what this will set it back to. So this should work. So if we go ahead and click play, now the players spawn, they don't drop. You'll see that they spawn right at the bottom there, and we can move as we would expect. And the camera is following us. And so one thing that I do want to point out is if you play the game in like a larger mode, you'll see it's kind of, it works fine, but you can see the player here is kind of jittering, if you will, like back and forth and stuff. That's something that we'll fix at some point here, because obviously you wouldn't want to put out a game where it's doing that. So we'll kind of fix those kind of things as well as they come up. and we'll work on those as we go throughout the series. But that's going to be everything for this video. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.